So firstly, I'd like to introduce our guest for today, Matthew Royal. Matthew has extensive experience in the real estate industry and finance industries. Prior to co-founding airlisting.com and Development Finance Partners, Matthew was an associate director of property finance at BankWest. He has exceptional knowledge in the understanding of the financial criteria and methodology used in assessing property development and investment proposals. Matthew advises property developers how to optimize the financing and marketing of their projects to achieve strategic improvements. Matthew has participated in the negotiation and consummation of numerous significant transactions involving property development loans, corporate loan notes, equity partners, mezzanine finance, joint venture partners, and construction finance loans. Matthew is regularly quoted by major media outlets such as the AFR and the Australian, and is a regular keynote speaker, panel expert, and moderator at various industry events. So thank you and welcome, Matthew.
Yeah, thanks, Julian. I appreciate the introduction and the opportunity to jump on and have a chat and share what information I can.
Great. So Matthew, I mean, with the market on fire, developments coming out of the ground everywhere you look, and even professionals outside the property industry looking to do their own side projects, I guess it begs the question, like, where do you think we are in the sort of cycle at the moment?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think we're certainly well and truly coming out of a recovery cycle into growth phase. There's no doubt there's some winners and losers in the property industry at the moment. I think inner city apartments have certainly struggled and are probably still in a depressed phase predominantly. Normally that's just associated with ultimately the renters and the population has declined largely, and the key drivers for CBD apartments and inner city have struggled, and the vacancy rates have climbed, and obviously the winners in this part of the property cycle have been suburban, infill, and regional, predominantly lifestyle orientated regional, but also affordable regional markets, which are disconnected from the CBDs, is clearly what's in a growth phase. And those markets to a large extent are fairly undersupplied. The rental market in the CBD locations and also coastal regional is extremely tight. That's certainly forcing a number of people that are in the rental market to come out of the rental market and to ultimately look to join the buyer pool for established properties, and obviously also potentially off the plan as well. So there's fundamental shifts in who the key demand drivers for obviously apartments and townhouses. We've seen home builder certainly give the construction industry a huge boost, although it's also unfortunately pushing cost to complete up as well, and creating some uncertainty in relation to cost escalation, which is a bit of a battle. Certainly a number of clients I'm speaking to, quantity surveyors and financiers, have all reported some fairly significant cost escalation, which is slightly concerning, probably especially to a number of the builders that the federal government was aiming to assist in bringing home builder to the market. Unfortunately, it's certainly creating some issues with cost to complete, and unfortunately a number of builders are being left holding contracts where the margins are probably diminishing fairly quickly at the moment. But outside of that, the markets generally in those markets that I mentioned is going pretty well.
Yeah, I mean, just everywhere I look, based in Brisbane, and obviously we've got the Gold Coast and Sunshine Coast, which are absolutely booming, and the Southern is moving up. It definitely feels like it's in that growth phase, that's for sure. So Matthew,
I guess what will be interesting on that front is if the demand curve has just been brought forward, and how sustainable that level of activity is going to be. Ultimately, time will tell. Without a net population growth occurring, which most of the high density to medium density projects have traditionally relied upon through migration coming into the country, to what extent people that were in Sydney and Melbourne who would have contemplated coming up to the Gold Coast and Sunshine Coast have just simply brought that decision forward. What's the pipeline of potential buyers that sit behind them will be interesting in the coming phases. Essentially, we'll probably only see that playing out towards the back end of this year into early next year. But certainly for now, it appears as though there's strong buyer appetite in those locations.
Yeah, absolutely. So you recently released an article with a similar title to today's webinar. I definitely borrowed the title from that. Can you sort of walk us through, what that entailed?
Yeah. Look, I think I just wanted to put down the fundamentals and a structured approach that we use in Development Finance Partners, which is best practice in order to go about the whole process from beginning to end as to how to make an application for finance in a step-by-step approach, and provided some level of detail inside of each of those steps to help, I guess, people that are new to finance, or perhaps even relatively experienced to obtaining finance, perhaps some new ideas and an approach and some insights based upon our experience as to how to go about the process in a structured way to manage risk and ultimately to get the best outcomes. Certainly in relation to conditions and terms and conditions, gearing, and obviously price as well.
Yeah, I mean, so because you say, one of the most important acknowledgements is you don't know what you don't know. Whether that applies to the new entrants, obviously coming in with a lower level of knowledge, or the more established guys in the market, as you say, just not knowing what they don't know, or potentially new techniques. So why do you think that's an important acknowledgement?
Yeah, look, I think what's important about any endeavor is to make sure you're dealing with the truth and what's real. And sometimes we get blind spots because of our own ego, and we get into a habitual process as well, that what we may think, or people may think to be the case about whether or not, for example, bank or non-bank finance is a better way to go, is not necessarily based upon what's real. And some people's experience of perhaps what was true of dealing with a bank 2 years ago is not necessarily true of dealing with a bank now. And the same goes for non-bank lending as well. So also, people also have got their own potential agenda with respect to recommending whether a bank or non-bank is the way to go. Ultimately, what's important is understanding, for your circumstances, based upon your objectives, what are the best options with respect to bank and non-bank lending, and how does that relate to not only individual stages of projects, but also at a group level, based upon what someone is wanting to achieve, whether it's rapid growth, they want to scale up their business, or whether or not they're more interested in maximizing profit by minimizing the financing costs. So ultimately, what's important is to understand that what you believe may be the case, or what some advisor may tell you is the right way to go, may not necessarily be the best approach for you. And really acknowledging that, and then having an open mind with respect to how do you best utilize bank and non-bank financing for your circumstances for an individual project, and making sure that that's consistent with the objectives that you have for the larger business is ultimately what I was wanting to get to there. Yeah,
as you say, I think things are changing so rapidly at the moment. 2 years ago, probably even 12 months ago, things have changed depending on which avenue you went down. So yeah, solid advice there. So you also, in one of your papers, just sort of described that classic example of the developer-banker relationship. So, I mean, for the developers on the webinar today, and sort of those would-be developers, can you explain sort of what motivates the bankers and how they can act? So who's pulling the strings kind of behind the scenes?
Yeah, like I think the banks, in my experience of having worked in a bank as a property finance banker, the key motivations for, I guess, a mainstream bank and would be, and speaking from a banker's perspective, not so much from a credit manager's perspective, the bankers are predominantly motivated by their budgets that they need to meet every year, their reputation, their standing within the bank, certainly their job security. They're ultimately led by their lending guidelines that the bank has set for those particular property financing products at the time. They're also particularly keen to ensure that the risk KPIs for arrears and irregulars accounts are kept to a minimum. Certainly when it comes to performance appraisal or time, the quality and the risk that's in their book, which is measured by largely irregular accounts, which are simply accounts that are outside of arrangements, and how long that persists for, and also interest arrears as well. So they're two particularly important reports that they are held accountable to. Their bonuses are obviously relative to the profitability of their book, and also how far in advance of the new lending targets that they've got to maintain per annum. And of course, keeping APRA happy, depending upon what are the expectations that APRA has of the bank at any one time, and what are the key things that their reports that they send to APRA, and what are the key fundamentals and KPIs that APRA is wanting to see the bank adhere to is particularly important. And really just a key focus on basic risk fundamentals is certainly what is another important factor of what motivates a banker. When it comes to non-banks, their motivations are a little bit different. Non-bank bankers are primarily motivated by winning deals. They do that by being able to charge ultimately more in return for ultimately acting faster and being more flexible with respect to risk hurdles. The other motivation from a non-bank lender is often in relation to the capital availability. So if they have access to capital, or they're managing their funds under management is significantly in advance of what they're currently utilising, then they've got more money than they have deals. So that's going to be a key driver in relation to how aggressively that they'll compete for risk and for price to win a deal. If they've got not enough capital and too many deals, then the obvious scenario is that they'll be less inclined to compete more aggressively on risk and price. But certainly in both circumstances, whether it be bank or non-bank, the clients that have generated the most amount of goodwill over a period of time ultimately have the most amount of influence. So clients that have demonstrated a strong track record with the bank or non-bank, who communicate with transparency, who are easy to deal with, whose reporting is solid, and ultimately they're reliable, and there's a personal level of trust that's been built both with the banker and also the credit officers that sit with either the bank or the non-bank. And that's the desire to maintain those customers is quite an important influence. It's probably fair to say in circumstances where the banks have got strong lending appetite and are encouraging their bankers to increase market share, at that point, the bankers, the frontline bankers, would hold probably the majority of the influence, certainly more influence than perhaps what the credit department might have. The reverse is true when the lending appetite is lower for various reasons. Certainly the credit risk officers generally are certainly pulling more of the strings and calling more of the shots. So yeah, so hopefully does that answer your question okay?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess, now that with that understanding of the motives of the lenders, let's say, pull them all together, the bank and non-bank, how does a developer then, you sitting in that position, how does a developer effectively communicate their position, their needs, their objectives, concerns, what support they require to get the most out of you in that respect?
Yeah, I went into the how to make a finance application like a pro, I went into a process of a step-by-step process. And the second step in that process was to effectively socialize opportunities and build relationships with various bankers, so that you can get to understand where the bankers are at in relation to their lending guidelines, their pricing, their concerns and objectives. So it's a process of first understanding before being understood, to use that cliche of 7 habits principle. But it's a really effective principle when it comes to I guess understanding what's market for risk and price, and qualifying your bank or your bankers up front, and building that relationship with them, and then ultimately being able to go back with a formal application for finance at a later time, having been well armed with really what is their appetite and what are their specific things that they're looking to see in credit applications, and what are the risks that they see in the market that you should probably spend a bit more time in managing those risks inside of your credit application. Yeah, so I think it's certainly in relationship building and spending time in qualifying yourself and the lenders to make sure that you're going to be on the same page with them.
Gotcha. Because yeah, I mean, the post GFC guidelines that sort of left most bankers, and you really articulated in 2 questions ago, like their hands tied in most cases. Like so where is that wiggle room? Where can a potential developer come in and know where the pressure points might be, or where they can get a little bit of extra out of their loan?
Yeah, look, I think the credit market is quite strong at the moment, both with banks and non-banks, and the best approach with respect to negotiation is to encourage competitive tension in a way that builds goodwill and doesn't destroy it. So there's nothing wrong with a borrower being upfront and transparent in a credit application after having socialized with the various bankers that you're going to go through a process of essentially a finance tender, and you're going to make an application to maybe 2 or 3 lenders on the basis that you're making an application based upon their earlier feedback that they've given you, so that there is competitive tension, and the bankers, if it's managed transparently and professionally, respect that you are going to market. And at the end of the day, whether it's a bank or non-bank, they are a supplier. They're just like any other supplier. They happen to be supplying credit, and there's a cost of that credit, and it comes with terms and conditions. And all of those things are negotiable at the end of the day. So that's really the best way to go about it. And that way, when, the healthy competition will ultimately always deliver the best outcomes in terms of a negotiation. So probably the worst thing that you can do is rely upon your existing financier and not have any other options, where that financier is ultimately going to be in control of the negotiation. And if you don't have other options, then ultimately you're going to have to take what they're going to give you. So that's always my best advice.
Gotcha. So what can developers do in that case or in some cases, to reduce their risk, and in turn increase their return on equity in today's market? Like, is there a few specific examples you could share?
Yeah, look, I've been doing property finance for a long time, and I've lost God knows how many project feasibilities, and I've looked at and advisory engagements, looking at the highest and best way to go about building a development program that, and also looking at not only individual project financing, but also how does project financing and various financing products from banks and non-banks, how can they be utilized to drive the outcomes that the developer specifically wants to achieve? And having looked at those things over a long period of time, what I started noticing that the most effective way to decrease risk and increase your return on equity is to invest effectively in advertising and marketing. It's the single best way to increase the rate of the sale across not only an individual project, but across the entirety of the group. The effect of increasing your sales rate is ultimately to give you the ability to recycle your equity and your profit in the fastest possible time, so you can turn over that equity and profit and compound its return back into more projects over time. So when you look up close at a project feasibility and a cash flow, you don't really see the effect of what effective advertising and marketing has, and especially the increase in the sales rate. It's only when you step back and take a longer, wider lens on the impact of sales and marketing and sales rate it has over a 5 to 10 to 15 year period. And when you see, and had the benefit of working with many established, very successful property developers, you can see it over a period of time that the developers that focus and develop strong capability, whether it be internally or externally, on effective sales and marketing, are the ones ultimately that grow into substantial businesses over time. And that's ultimately how they've done it. There's no doubt you can get serious leverage from finance, but where the real leverage on a cost to complete or a feasibility is in the advertising and marketing budget. And it's interesting because it's often the most neglected that I see, which is sometimes surprising, especially where property developers are seeking minimum to no pre-sales in some cases, and yet they neglect to manage the market risk that they've now taken on and invest in reducing the market risk with advertising and marketing budget. Especially when the impact that effective advertising and marketing has on decreasing the total cost of sale by reducing the amount of commissions that has to be paid, the ability for you to qualify for larger amounts of cheaper debt is dramatically improved by effective advertising and marketing. And ultimately, the total profitability of the project is greatly improved. So on multiple KPIs, that is the most effective way to increase return on investment and to decrease risk.
Well, I guess that answers my next question, or at least one of them, because what are some of the biggest mistakes that developers make when seeking funding, and maybe you just pointed to one of them there being not allocating enough budget or not having a proper structured plan in that sales and marketing side of things. Is there anything else that sort of one or two things that popped to mind?
Yeah, I think accepting what your existing financier is willing to offer you. Your existing financier shouldn't be your default financial advisor. They've got a particular duty of care, not to you, but to their employer. And they're very limited in the type of product that they can offer you. Unfortunately, on too many occasions, the existing financier will ultimately seek to cross-securitize as many of your assets as possible. Often you're unaware that regardless of whether you've specifically crossed up and provided security across your various entities and across your various projects, ultimately there's an interlinking guarantee via your personal guarantee, which ultimately is a cross-default provision, which means that you could potentially have a domino effect right across your portfolio. By going into default with one facility, your personal guarantee that links them all essentially puts the rest of your portfolio at risk, and potentially at the worst possible time. The financier's incentive then is to look at your most liquid assets, your most valuable assets, to sell down in order to recover whatever is the defaulting loan covenant that you may have incurred at that time. So essentially, that would be the first one, which is really just a lack of time and energy spent not building relationships with multiple financiers. And when looking at a risk analysis of any business, having too much concentration risk with any one supplier or any one customer is ultimately a very big risk. So diversifying your finances across multiple financiers and strategically managing that risk, and also giving you access to multiple financing products and the ability to negotiate more effectively with when it comes time to debt procurement. So that would be probably the number one mistake that I would see. Not engaging a specialist financier if you're not experienced, and even if you are experienced in terms of arranging debt, it is a specialist area. I've spent longer than the last 20 years dedicating my career to structured property finance. And for us, it's even difficult to keep up with all of the changing lending guidelines and various providers in our marketplace, let alone all the little nuances and the ability for us as a third party agent to effectively manage the relationships and to negotiate competitive debt terms as a third party, where you're not having to do that directly with a financier, especially if it's a financier that has a majority of your securities under their control. So whether it's you need to engage a structural engineer, a town planner, or an architect, ultimately a specialist construction finance advisor should be engaged in the majority of circumstances to achieve the best outcomes. Now, clearly, I have an agenda to say that, but the reality is that it's just true. And the other biggest mistake would be to engage the wrong advisor. Ultimately, the wrong advisor is someone that doesn't have a track record, a significant track record of delivering effective finance settlements for their clients. They don't have the experience that's required to engage in this space effectively and to manage risk. And ultimately, they don't have the qualifications to do it. Unfortunately, there's nothing prohibiting a general finance broker from purporting to be able to provide construction finance. And certainly there are a number of bank and non-bank financiers that are willing to accept an application from a general broker who doesn't necessarily have the experience in this space. But ultimately, what will be lacking will be the result for the client. So that would be the third big mistake that I would see.
Gotcha. Okay, so as developers prepare their proposals, what's an example of some credit strengths and weaknesses that they may have that might be highlighted from the lending side? And then what are some strategies to really get that credit enhancement going?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think what's most important in a credit application is to really understand what your strengths are and really focus on those strengths to mitigate naturally the weaknesses that are sitting within any finance application. There'll be potentially one or two or potentially more credit weaknesses, and understanding what those things are is very important. Focusing on the strengths of your credit application has the effect of fundamentally overcoming a number of the natural weaknesses that will exist, and then using credit enhancements to then mitigate the credit weaknesses that you have fundamentally within the project, or within the overall credit application. So an example of a credit strength would be that the location of the project is fundamentally strong. An example of that at the moment may be an owner-occupied, well-designed beachfront location on the Gold Coast, where the market uptake and the sales rate is particularly strong, and that would be an example. Or it might be the location is an infill location in the greater area of Sydney, Melbourne, or Brisbane, or Perth, and there's a shortage of supply. There is an active market and a depth of market in downsizers, first home buyers, and those are the fundamentally sound markets. An example of another credit strength is a top tier builder, where the delivery risk is undoubted, would be certainly a credit strength. A weakness, an example of that would be the borrower may not have completed a project of similar size before, or more than 10% of the existing pre-sales are secured by only 5% deposits. So an example of a credit enhancement strategy would be if in the case that the borrower has not completed projects of similar size, then the engagement of an external development manager and project manager would be a good example of how to go about mitigating the weakness, which is the lack of experience. Whether if, for example, a credit weakness may be that it's an owner builder and we don't have the benefit of a third party builder, and ultimately the guarantees that sit in the build contract aren't available, and we've got a concentration risk now of credit to the borrower for not only the borrowings but also the delivery of the project. An additional 5% contingency budget would serve to help mitigate the concentration risk that attaches to the owner builder. Another credit enhancement strategy might be the use of mezzanine finance to lower the senior debt LVR and increase the debt cover ratios is another example of how you may be able to identify, especially in socializing the opportunity or the credit application up front, is to get feedback from the banker. How do they see this credit strengths and how do they see the weaknesses of what you're proposing? And then to be able to go away and work to enhance the credit. Or in some cases, the bankers may be willing to offer you some feedback in relation to how they see credit enhancement, some particular strategies to suit your situation and how they see the deal.
Gotcha. So, I mean, in today's world, especially in the construction and property world, more and more technology is getting introduced, which I'm sure can give source of truths to market fundamentals, give everyone a better perspective on what's going on. As an example, is there any other tech solutions that you sort of have seen that help developers in general?
Yeah, well, certainly at the risk of self-promotion, using tech solutions such as our listing has certainly been proven to effectively increase sales rates and reduce sales costs and increase sales into a local market. And certainly that's been effective. Another example certainly would be Aprao, which is obviously able to effectively use technology to identify and financially sensitize project feasibilities and cash flows, and to really see what the impact is on lending safety. And depending upon the sensitivity of the financial modelling, then the real effect of the potential credit risks can be better understood and quantified. And that certainly has a potential impact on then how and to what extent you might utilise credit enhancement strategies to really appropriately manage the risk that may come from, for example, let's say that we had a credit weakness and a lending guideline exemption to 5% pre-sale contracts. So we might have 20% of the pre-sales budget secured by only 5% deposits instead of 10%. So then you can go about the process of assuming that all of the 5%, all the contracts that are secured by 5% fail to complete. So what's the real effect on the residual LVR at that point? So you can sensitize any number of different scenarios effectively and negotiate reasonable credit enhancements and reasonable conditions with financiers if you can effectively model your project feasibilities and your cash flows.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, I think there's a lot of technology out there today that most people think of robots laying bricks when they think of property technology, but the reality is there's a lot more sophisticated tech out there that's giving more visibility to the market, both on the lending side and on the developer side as well. And you mentioned it there. And yeah, Aprao, for example, does that, but with a clear summary automatically just produced from the feasibility. It's sent to the lenders. It's sort of been signed off on their side of exactly what they want to see, how they want to see it, and they can come back to you very quickly with proposals and getting on with terms in that negotiation, as you alluded to. So I might just quickly flick to some questions from the audience, and I know we're going back in time here, but there was one question that came through. Do you have a rule of thumb or a recommendation on how much marketing budget should be set as a percentage of total sales?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it comes down to what are the conditions in the market, and how much are you relying upon, for example, a no pre-sales strategy. So if you are working with a bank and you're 100% debt cover, then the marketing budget, advertising and marketing budget that you should allow for during the course of the construction should be relatively lower than if you're going into a project and your strategy is a no pre-sales financing strategy. So something in the order of around 1% of the GRV is typically a good all-up budget to allow for the sell down of all of the lots. The application of, and when you spend that, which is ideally if you're going with a higher pre-sales strategy, the majority of that would be spent in your pre-construction budget prior to the financing settling. The more that you're introducing market risk by lowering the pre-sales that you're happy to proceed with, the more that budget should potentially go up, and the more that you'll obviously be deploying during the period of construction, and certainly in the residual sell down of any unsold stock on completion. So that's hopefully that gives you a bit of a budget and when that should be spent.
Yeah, understood. Okay, I mean, I think that's all the questions that we received so far from the Q&A. So Matthew, what's the best way for today's audience to get in touch if they have any sort of further questions or potentially want to engage you moving forward?
Yeah, if anyone's interested in chatting with me, either about DFP or air listing, feel free to reach out to me. My DFP email address is fine, which is just mroyal@dfpartners.com.au, or you can just find me on LinkedIn, or obviously through Development Finance Partners website, which is just dfpartners.com.au. Perfect.
All right, well, I think we'll wrap it up there. So, I mean, thank you for your time, Matthew. And thank you everyone that's joined today as well. I hope that was a very insightful session on positioning your loan application in the best way possible. And if anyone does have any recommendations on topics or people that you think we should speak to, please do let me know. But until then, take care and good luck in lockdown.
Thanks all. Thanks, Julian.
Thank you very much. Bye.